Robert Hormats is the Undersecretary of State for Economics and is a champion of anti-counterfeiting efforts for pharmaceuticals worldwide. Mr. Hormats formerly served as Vice Chairman of Goldman Sachs International. He previously served as an Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs from 1981 to 1982, Ambassador and Deputy U.S. Trade Representative from 1979 to 1981, and Senior Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic and Business Affairs at the Department of State from 1977 to 1979. He served as a senior staff member on the National Security Council from 1969 to 1977, where he was a senior economic advisor to Drs. Henry Kissinger and Dr. Brzezinski and General Brent Scowcroft. Bob earned a BA with a concentration in economics and political science from Tufts in 1965, and an MA in 1966, and a PhD in international economics in 1970 from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Please welcome Undersecretary Hormats.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you. Well, I want to, first of all, thank all of you for coming to this very important conference on this very cold day in Washington. I know some of you have traveled some distances to come here, so it's deeply appreciated. Also, I want to commend you and Victoria and your team for setting up this conference. This is extremely important. And the topics on which you're going to be deliberating today and hearing speeches today are highly important to the future of our country and to millions and millions and millions of people who can benefit and are looking to people in this room and others to help them to benefit from improving regulations and practices on consumer health and safety. You've already heard from a number of others today about a particularly heinous crime, and that is the sale of counterfeit medicines. Counterfeit drugs are a growing global menace, not only to Americans, but also to consumers around the world. The problem is particularly severe in developing countries, where a combination of weak consumer protection, inadequate law enforcement, a lack of public awareness, official skepticism, and low incomes create, in many cases, an environment that allows counterfeit medicines to be sold or to be used by needy patients. Data on the magnitude of this problem is highly limited because many of these countries don't collect the kind of data that we do in the United States. Some sources estimate that as much as a third of drugs sold in developing countries are counterfeit and or substandard. Even if that number is only half or a tenth of that estimate, that's far too many people being subject to the dangers of fake medicines. The United States is committed at the very highest levels to protecting our citizens, and indeed all people around the world, from these inherently dangerous drugs. For the next few minutes, I'm going to focus on what the State Department, in concert with Victoria and her team and others in the U.S. government, are doing to stop the spread of counterfeit medicines around the world. Our anti-counterfeit medicines effort can be grouped into four basic pillars. One, anti-crime capacity building. Two, public diplomacy and outreach. Three, targeted U.S. aid programs around the world. And four, working within international forums in various areas. The first pillar is the anti-crime capacity building. The State Department manages a foreign assistance fund for government-to-government training and technical assistance for those fighting against intellectual property rights crime. These are projects where the U.S. law enforcement, customs and border, and judicial officials work with their counterparts in developing countries to develop and build the capacity to protect IP. Although in previous years many programs had included some attention to combating counterfeit medicines, this year brings a new focus on stopping the trade in counterfeit medicines. We're planning to direct $1.3 million, about 31% of our total anti-IP crime training and capacity budget, to programs aimed at combating counterfeit medicines. This includes projects in Ecuador, in Peru, Kenya, in addition to regional projects in Latin America, Southern Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. These programs were designed and will be implemented by the Departments of Justice, of Homeland Security, and the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office in close collaboration with relevant U.S. embassies and consulates. The second pillar, public diplomacy and outreach. In addition to government training and capacity building, there is a need for outreach because right now there is little global awareness of the problem and the depth of the problem of counterfeit drugs. For example, a study in Laos found that 63% of drug sellers and about 90% of consumers were unaware of the existence of fake drugs in their drug supply. A survey of Indian consumers found that only 19% of consumers thought that counterfeit drugs could contain dangerous or toxic ingredients. To improve global awareness about counterfeit medicines, the State Department has dedicated $200,000 this year for a new public diplomacy initiative, our campaign against counterfeit medicines. With this funding, our embassy in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and in Brasilia have organized counterfeit medicines awareness seminars for healthcare providers in cooperation with the University of Sao Paulo and with Brazil's Pharmaceutical Licensing Commission. In Sri Lanka, our embassy partnered with private and public shareholders to create a series of 4 countrywide workshops on counterfeit drugs. Other countries where the State Department has funded anti-counterfeit medicine public diplomacy programs have included Bolivia, Peru, Jordan, Kenya, Congo, Brazzaville, Bosnia, Ukraine, Paraguay, Sudan, Tanzania, and Guinea. So as you can see, it's quite an extensive program, and we aim to continue this program in the years ahead. The third pillar is targeted U.S. AID foreign assistance programs. In addition to the law enforcement capacity building and public awareness efforts that I've just outlined, USAID has launched an initiative to assure the quality, safety, and efficacy of medicines. The Promoting of the Quality of Medicines Program, or PQM, is a 5-year, $35 million cooperative agreement between USAID and the U.S. Pharmacopeal Convention, the USP. PQM successes thus far include: 1, the development of a robust drug quality surveillance program in 19 African, Asian, and Latin American countries, leading to recalls of substandard and counterfeit medicines and closures of illicit pharmacies. And for example, in Ghana, the PQM program helped identify and recall counterfeit and substandard versions of 13 anti-malarial drugs in government hospitals, in private clinics, and in pharmacies throughout the country. The PQM program will expand on these and other activities in Asia, in Eastern Europe, in Latin America, and much of sub-Saharan Africa. The fourth pillar is cooperation with international organizations. I've highlighted a number of areas where the U.S. is leading the way in curbing the spread of counterfeit medicines. It is, however, important to recognize that the trade in illicit pharmaceuticals is a global problem. Thus, it is vital that we partner with other countries and other governments and other institutions to maximize the effectiveness of our programs and the global effort. The State Department works extensively with international organizations such as the World Health Organization and the World Intellectual Property Organization to raise awareness of the problem of counterfeit medicines and to encourage the search for solutions. We recently awarded a grant to WIPO to develop a new toolkit on the public health and safety consequences associated with IP infringing activities in this area. Unfortunately, within the WHO, there is often opposition to anti-counterfeit medicines initiatives, usually based on the misconception that these efforts could reduce access to generic medicines. This is, of course, not the case. The United States is advocating for strong regulatory systems which are necessary to ensure access to safe and effective medicines, regardless of whether that medicine is patent protected or is generic. This isn't an issue that we can afford to be dragged down on by semantics. Finally, in the lead up to the U.S. Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, which the United States will host in 2011, which is going to involve the leaders of the United States, President Obama, and the leaders of many countries throughout Asia, we're working to develop activities and events that will highlight the importance and develop new approaches to combating counterfeit medicines in the Asia-Pacific region. This is going to be a major initiative. The President of China, the Prime Minister of Japan, the President of the United States, and the Prime Ministers or Presidents of many countries in East Asia and in Latin America, because it is a Pacific initiative, will be there. And this will perhaps be the most visible example of head of state, head of government level in addressing this issue, and we're doing it in a very comprehensive way. And in many cases, this group, APEC, has taken the lead on a variety of issues globally, and when it takes the lead, many other institutions follow. So we look at this as a major priority. The meeting will be in the President's home state. It'll be in Honolulu, and this is going to be a major topic. So you can anticipate that not only at that summit, but in the preparations for that summit, there's going to be a lot of work done, and we're going to be consulting with many people in this industry to get their views, their ideas, and their thoughts to make sure we do it the right way and give it not only visibility, but a purposeful sense of follow-up. Let me conclude on one final point, and that is that I think it's quite evident, and I think the view is shared in this room, that we cannot allow criminals to exploit vulnerable patients in need of medicines. It is therefore imperative that we refocus and redouble our stances in the global fight against counterfeit medicines. In the last year alone, the State Department, working with USAID and other agencies, has significantly raised the profile of this issue and incorporated anti-counterfeit agendas into many of our programs abroad. This is a priority which, when I first took over in my job in September last year, I worked very hard on, because I'd seen, having lived in Africa and spent much time in the developing world, seen the consequences of the kinds of problems that we're talking about here today, and met with Peggy Hamburg and many people on her team to make sure that the State Department and the FDA work closely together on this very serious issue. We're going to continue our strategy of improved enforcement, of public outreach, and greater global cooperation until everyone has access to safe medicines. It has to be one of our highest priorities. It is certainly one of my highest priorities. It is a priority that Secretary Clinton is energetically involved in, and I know that others in this administration, Victoria in particular and her team, many others with whom she works, share this view. So I again want to thank all of you for coming and all of you for participating in this process, and to assure you that the State Department stands ready to work with you, work with Victoria and her team and others in the U.S. government. This is something that we have a moral responsibility to address. We have an economic responsibility to address. And if we're going to do the kind of things we need to improve outcomes, medical outcomes around the world, addressing this issue is highly important to millions and millions of people who look to all of us in this room for the kind of leadership that's required to address this forthrightly and deal with this terrible scourge. And I thank you very much for listening.
We're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about other types of trademark infringement that affect the health and safety of consumers. And we are pleased to have the preeminent expert here. Inez Tenenbaum is the chairman of the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Previously, Ms. Tenenbaum served 2 terms as South Carolina's State Superintendent of Education. She previously practiced health, environmental, and public interest law with the law firm of Sinkler & Boyd. Ms. Tenenbaum received her Bachelor of Science in 1972 and Masters of Education degrees in 1974 from the University of Georgia, and her law degree in 1986 from the University of South Carolina. Please welcome Chairman Tenenbaum.
Well, good morning, everyone. We should have let everyone know that some of us need a shorter lectern, but I think you can see me. Thank you, Andrew, for that very kind introduction, and I want to thank Victoria for the invitation to speak to this important forum. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with the Consumer Product Safety Commission, we are an independent federal agency that prevents deaths and serious injuries by regulating the safety of thousands of consumer products. Occasionally, those products are found to be counterfeit. Now, many of you may know that you may know of the CPSC through the recalls that we announced in the news. Cribs, Chinese drywall, those have all been high-profile cases. But we also set performance standards. We detain dangerous goods at the ports of entry and conduct inspections in the marketplace, and work with foreign regulators to promote best manufacturing practices in compliance with U.S. safety laws. We are a stronger agency today, better equipped to protect the safety of all consumers, including children, than in the years past. We are also more focused on injury prevention and tackling emerging hazards than in the past. This forum today is invaluable because we do not want counterfeit consumer products that can maim or kill to become an emerging health or safety issue for the CPSC. At this time, they are not. But we need to take steps toward prevention rather than relying on reaction. The threshold for the CPSC's involvement in counterfeiting goes beyond mere intellectual property theft. In order for us to act, there must be a false representation of a brand and the risk of physical harm to the consumer. So we cannot come in just on counterfeit goods. We have to show that there's a risk of physical harm to the consumer for us to get involved. Fortunately, at the CPSC, we have not experienced a wave of dangerous counterfeits, nor have we encountered a counterfeit consumer product that has caused fatalities. Yet our eye is always on electrical products because our experience tells us that that's where the greatest risk lies to the consumer. Over the past 10 years, we have announced 12 recalls due to counterfeiting. Those recalls involve circuit breakers, power cords, a power washer, lithium-ion cell phone batteries, and conference call phone batteries. The highest profile cases handled by the CPSC occurred in 2004. In the midst of media attention on incidents involving overheated cell phone batteries, Kyocera and Verizon Wireless discovered more than 1 million potentially counterfeit cell phone batteries that had made their way into the marketplace. Between the two companies, there were more than 30 reports of incidences, including smokes, property damage, and minor burn injuries. Both companies moved to address the issues swiftly and worked in concert with the CPSC staff in doing so. An apparent counterfeiting of the Verizon Wireless and the Kyocera cell phone batteries is one of the key factors in the CPSC teaming up with the wireless industry to recommend that consumers buy replacement cell phone batteries and chargers only from the company that sold them the phone. With the other counterfeit product recalls, we have uncovered cases where consumers were at risk of fires or shock. In addition, there was one case in which a pressure washer had a counterfeit shock protection device. This put consumers at risk of electrocution. Think about it. Counterfeiters undermine the confidence that consumers should have in a device that is intended to protect them when working with electricity and water. Now, we are gathered at this forum today in the midst of the holiday season, at a time when Christmas lights are being hung and extension cords are being used to power up decorations and new appliances. These are two product lines that CPSC and Customs and Border Protection always focus on this time of the year. The possibility that counterfeiters might use undersized wiring in holiday lights and extension cords is a serious concern when it comes to fire safety and the potential for electric shock injuries. The ability of counterfeiters to create a fake marking of an independent testing laboratory, even a fake hologram, poses another avenue for them to undermine consumer confidence. The need for consumers to have confidence in these markings is critical. For years, the CPSC has advised the public to look for these markings before publishing lights and extension cords. Keith Williams, the president of Underwriters Laboratories, will address this issue during the next panel. His company has made investments to stay ahead of the counterfeiters. In addition to those products that have been subject to recalls, CPSC also keeps an eye on surge protectors, lamps, light bulbs, and alkaline batteries, all of which can be counterfeited. The CPSC field investigators are increasing their attention to signs of counterfeiting in the marketplace. As one of our senior officials has stated, think about the process for a moment. You are a manufacturer, likely located overseas, with the goal of illegally replicating another manufacturer's electrical product, such as a power cord or a toaster. You want the counterfeit product to be undetectable, yet your goal is to manufacture the product at a much lower cost to increase your unit profit. Piece by piece, you look for vendors who can provide similar components to those used in the authentic product, but at a very low cost. Of course, reducing the cost is easier if you don't have to use the higher quality components required to meet U.S. voluntary standards and mandatory safety standards. As chairman of the CPSC, I have made numerous visits to China to ensure the Chinese suppliers and Chinese government understand what is at stake. During meetings with my counterparts with the Chinese government, I have stressed the importance of complying with U.S. safety standards in designing and manufacturing goods intended for our marketplace. Now we have an agreement with the Chinese government on this approach to manufacturing. If we can move foreign markets to adhere to and check for compliance with U.S. standards, we not only can make imports safer, but we can also minimize the risk of injury if an imported product is counterfeited. We know that intellectual property theft can have a terrible impact on the economy. You go to China and you go into the markets and you just see one counterfeit product after another, just standing up there waiting for you to buy. And it can affect the company's bottom lines. And for this reasons and more, intellectual product theft must be stopped. Thankfully, many of the counterfeits that come into the country do not pose a safety risk to consumers. Because this forum is being broadcast on the White House website, I want to send a clear message to overseas regulators. We need your help in shutting down businesses and factories that are stealing reputable U.S. brands and making dangerous counterfeits. In 2007 and 2008, factories were closed that were found to be using lead paints in toys. I say to my counterparts in other countries, we need the same action taken against those who are corrupting the supply chain with counterfeit materials and markings. In the next panel, you will hear from Brett Brenner, the president of Electrical Safety Foundation International. ESFI is one of the nation's leading voices in educating the public about the telltale signs of counterfeit electrical products and what steps must be taken to address this problem. Visit the website esfi.org, as there is a whole section dedicated to building awareness and providing strategies for combating the problems of counterfeit electrical products. At the CPSC, we have a steady eye on and a noticeable presence in 3 key places where we can try to detect and stop counterfeiting: at the ports, on the internets, and brick-and-mortar retailers. In 2009, the CPSC collected nearly 1,800 samples at the ports and determined that more than 55% were violative or dangerous consumer products. We kept adding new tools and technologies to our import safety strategy, which has helped us sort through more products at the ports without the need to send the samples to laboratories. The nearly 1,000 products that we stopped from reaching the market last year were more than the total number of import samples we collected in the year before we joined Customs and Border Protection in co-locating staff at the ports. Online, our Internet Surveillance Unit is stopping nearly 1,000 auctions each year that involve previously recalled or dangerous products. And in the marketplace, we are empowering our field investigators with more information about what to look for on packagings and markings. If a field investigator believes that a product may be counterfeit and hazardous, a sample can be sent to our laboratory for further inspection and testing. Finally, it is my hope that in the very near future, CPSC will establish a formal partnership with the National Intellectual Property Rights Coordination Center in Arlington, Virginia. Partnering with the NIPRC will help CPSC pool our investigative resources because we are a very small agency, and it will be more in tune with seizures of counterfeits that may pose substantial products hazards. So as you can see, we have a multi-layered strategy to address counterfeiting, a strategy that aims to protect the U.S. businesses as well as consumers. Before turning the podium over to the outstanding panel that will follow, I wanted to share with you that 2010 has been a year of positive change at the CPSC. At the beginning of the year, I spoke to a gathering of the international product safety community, and I made a prediction. I predicted that 2010 would be the year of the consumer. Well, that prediction proved to be correct, and the CPSC took a number of steps to help make sure that it was indeed a good year for consumers. We continued to make sure that the makers of children's products complied with the stringent lead limits that we have in this country. As a result, in 2010, there were only 3 recalls of toys due to lead violations. Now that's progress. We worked through the year at the CPSC to make sure that we're on time and on budget to launch a new searchable public database on product incidences. This consumer database will be launched in March as a part of the saferproducts.gov website. Consumers will be able to use the website to report product incidences to the government and will have open access to search for incidents reported by consumers. This is another example of how the CPSC is creating tools to empower consumers. And in keeping with the promise that I made to parents, we are on pace to approve new crib safety rules before this year's end. These rules are intended to usher in a new generation of safer cribs in 2011. It has been 30 years since we had a new crib standard in the United States. From stopping dangerous counterfeits to creating more safeguards for children products, CPSC stands for safety. Thank you for allowing me to speak today, and thank you for the efforts that many of you are making to protect the business community and our consumers. Thank you.
As these guys get settled, I will begin. Lanny Brewer is the Assistant Attorney General of the Criminal Division at the Department of Justice. As the head of the Criminal Division, Mr. Brewer oversees more than 500 attorneys who prosecute federal criminal cases across the country. Mr. Brewer began his legal career as an assistant DA in Manhattan, where he prosecuted violent crimes. In 1989, he joined the law firm of Covington and Burling, where he worked until 1997. In 1997, he joined the White House counsel's office as special counsel to then President William Jefferson Clinton. As special counsel, Mr. Brewer assisted in defending President Clinton in the Senate impeachment trial. Mr. Brewer received his BA from Columbia College in 1980, his JD from Columbia Law School in 1985. Please welcome Lanny Brewer.
Thank you, Andrew, and good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here, and I see that you've really had quite a program already this morning. As Andrew said, I'm fortunate enough to be the Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Department of Justice's Criminal Division. And so I'm so pleased to be here today with all of you as we discuss intellectual property and to discuss at this great forum the critical topic of protecting consumers' health and safety. First and foremost, I want to thank Victoria Espinel for inviting me to participate and to applaud her for her remarkable commitment and leadership in bringing attention to these incredibly important issues. She's really done an outstanding job in her tenure already. I also want to express my appreciation to all of you for being here today and for the work you do every day to ensure that consumers receive safe and legitimate goods. The speakers, as I understand already that you heard this morning, have set the stage for our upcoming discussion. I know I don't have to tell anyone in this room about the potential risks we all face when counterfeits enter our markets. But experience does teach us that perhaps more so than for any other type of crime out there, we do have to remind the public, both consumers and businesses, of the seriousness of counterfeit goods and the very real dangers that they present. All too often, IP is not treated as a serious crime because it's perceived as a victimless crime. But of course, nothing could be further from the truth. The public understands the seriousness of crimes that endanger people's lives and safety. The public understands the seriousness of crimes that rob people of their financial futures. The public understands the seriousness of crimes that threaten our national security. Yet IP crime, and in particular the sale of counterfeit goods, is all of these things. It's the sale of counterfeit pharmaceuticals and other consumer products that endanger consumer health and safety. It's the theft of profits from American businesses that can destroy companies and cost our citizens their jobs and their livelihoods. It's the sale of counterfeit computer and network hardware intended for use by the military that threatens the safety of our troops, or intended for critical IT infrastructure that threatens our national security. So part of our challenge is not just to investigate and prosecute these crimes, but to continue our efforts to educate the public that this is a serious crime with serious consequences. It costs jobs, it risks lives, it threatens the foundation of our nation's economy, and it endangers our national security. For these reasons, the criminal enforcement of intellectual property rights is an issue of central importance to the Department of Justice. That is why Attorney General Holder, whom you all heard from this morning, has made the protection of IP rights a top law enforcement priority. To combat IP crime, we can work closely with our partners throughout the U.S. government, in the private sector, and around the globe. Beginning with the Department's first IP initiative announced by then Deputy Attorney General Eric Holder 11 years ago, DOJ has indeed created and developed a comprehensive IP criminal enforcement program designed to address the increasingly sophisticated and diverse methods of committing IP crime. Key components of our department's enforcement program include highly specialized federal prosecutors and computer forensic experts in the Criminal Division's Computer Crime and Intellectual Property section, known as CSIPs. These attorneys assist in developing and implementing the department's overall IP enforcement strategy and also prosecute many of the largest multi-district and international cases. They are simply brilliant lawyers, incredibly committed, and the lawyers and the experts in that section work throughout the nation and really throughout the world. In addition, we have a network of over 230 computer hacking and intellectual property or chip prosecutors represented in each of our 94 U.S. attorneys' offices nationwide. These attorneys are specially trained in prosecuting IP offenses and computer crime and receive unique resources to combat these crimes in their districts. These programs continue to grow, I'm proud to say, and in just the past year, we have increased the resources devoted to criminal IP enforcement by adding 15 new chip prosecutors and over 50 FBI special agents dedicated exclusively to investigating IP crime. A robust international program is also part of what we do. That program targets key countries and regions for capacity building and operational assistance, and it includes the placement of 2 experienced prosecutors overseas to serve as intellectual property law enforcement coordinators, or IPLEX, one in Eastern Europe and the other in Asia. And then we have increased outreach to and a positive working relationship with a broad range, a broad cross-section indeed, of IP rights holders. This last point, the positive working relationship with IP rights holders, is the reason, of course, that I am here today. We at the Justice Department, of course, cannot carry out our enforcement mission without input and assistance from the victims of IP crime. We recognize that it is the victims of IP crime who are often in the best position to know when their products are being illegally copied, or who can provide invaluable assistance in identifying and distinguishing counterfeits from legitimate goods. With me today, I'm proud to say, are 4 leaders in the fight to protect American consumers and businesses from counterfeit goods that can endanger our health and safety. Now, I know you've heard this morning about the dangers of counterfeit pharmaceuticals, but I'm hopeful in this panel we can talk about other products and the array and how dangerous some of those can be when they, too, are the product of counterfeiting. So I'm looking forward to our discussion of our problems, and I'm looking forward for the opportunity at the end for all of you in the audience to ask questions. So I'm going to briefly introduce our 4 panelists and then have each of them speak with you briefly, and then we'll begin our discussion. Closest to me is Neil Rubin. Neil is Vice President of Litigation at Cisco Systems, Inc. Of course, Cisco is a worldwide leader in the design and production of hardware to run computer networks. Neil manages the company's portfolio of commercial and intellectual property litigation and is acutely aware of the scope and sophistication of the counterfeiting of his company's products. Indeed, I had the honor of knowing Neil even before I became AAG. Next to Neil is Keith Williams, President of Underwriters Laboratories. Keith has served as the President of Underwriters Laboratories, Inc. since 2005. UL is an independent standards development organization, testing lab, and certification body with a mission to enhance safety and facilitate global commerce. Consumers worldwide, as we know, rely on the UL label as an assurance of safety, which in turn has made it a mark, a prime mark for counterfeiters. Indeed, I bet there are many people out there who think UL is part of the government because it's so pervasive and people rely upon it so much. Robert Borghese is president of the International Anti-Counterfeiting Coalition. Bob is the president of the International Anti-Counterfeiting Coalition and does so much in that capacity. The IACC is the largest U.S.-based organization that exclusively represents the interests of companies concerned with piracy and trademark counterfeiting. The IACC has approximately 200 corporate, trade association, and professional firm members representing a wide cross-section of industries, including automotive, entertainment, software, apparel, luxury goods, footwear, personal care, pharmaceutical sectors, and one can go on and on. And lastly, at the end, is Brett Brenner. Brett was named president of the Electrical Safety Foundation International, ESFI, in October of 2005. ESFI was formerly the National Electrical Safety Foundation, and it is North America's only nonprofit organization dedicated exclusively to promoting electrical safety in the home, school, and workplace. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. Neil, do you want to start us off?
Sure, thanks, Lanny. Well, as Lanny said, I'm the Vice President of Litigation at Cisco, and Cisco is a market leader in computer networking equipment. We design, build, and sell routing, switching, telephony, and security products. And those products are designed to allow data and information to flow securely, safely, effectively across the internet. Let me start off by saying how flattered I am on behalf of Cisco to be asked to be here. Our company has a long history of partnering with the U.S. government on issues that are important to the IT industry and issues that are important to the economy as a whole. And I think this, what we're talking about today in the area of counterfeit is perhaps just the latest example of that. I think that Cisco has been asked to participate today because we are a good example of the kind of private-public partnership that people have spoken about already on the panel today. in that internally we've put a lot of resources into combating and mitigating the problems related to counterfeit products. But we've also been a primary beneficiary of the great skill and experience and resources that have been put to this issue by law enforcement agencies all over the United States, indeed all over the world. And so I hope I'll have an opportunity later this morning to talk about a few examples where we've had the opportunity to work successfully together with the government.
Keith?
Yeah, Lanny, thank you very much. On behalf of UL, I can say it's also a great privilege for us to be participating in this program today. You gave a nice introduction of us, and no, we're not part of the government, although I have had customers in Korea ask me that. You know, they said, well, UL, your job is to prevent Korean products from getting into the U.S. market. And we say, no, it's only to prevent unsafe Korean products. UL it's actually, we're a 116-year-old company, and we're a 501c3, which a lot of people don't know. And we do really two things. We're a standards development organization, and we develop and manage about 1,300 standards in the U.S., which are primarily related to product safety, although increasingly related to environmental safety as well. And those standards are really mostly ANSI standards, and so they're consensus standards, and they're really just related to safety of a wide range of products, from lighting products to home appliances, to plastics materials, and even the gasoline dispensers that you might come across at your local Quickie Mart. And so it's a wide range of things. And the second thing that we do is we do testing and certification of products to assess the conformity to the safety standard. UL's been active in anti-counterfeiting for 16 years. And probably everybody in this room knows Brian Monks, who leads the operation. It started really as an internal activity, simply for the purpose of protecting our own brand integrity. And we've learned over the years, as all the speakers have said today, the importance of partnerships, partnerships within industry and partnerships between the public and the private sector. We started 3 years ago as the organizers of an international law enforcement conference on intellectual property rights crime, which successfully brings about 400 to 500 people a year from law enforcement around the world together. Many of you had been there, so you know the conference. We think that's a good example of how a public-private partnership can work. And we've also started a private partnership just within our own industry by trying to bring together, for the testing and certification industry in the world, an industry association against counterfeiting. Because one of the things we can do as a testing and certification industry is make sure that people who are making counterfeit or substandard products aren't just moving from testing company to testing company, staying one step ahead of having the mark recalled. And so we think there's things we can do together to help fight this as well.
Great, thanks, Keith. Bob?
Sure. First, I want to thank the IPEC coordinator, Victoria Espinel, and for inviting us, as well as the staff, for putting this forum together. Also in advance, I want to thank Lonnie Brewer for agreeing to interpret my New York accent and translate that back into English for the crowd.
It's one of my great expertise.
So you've heard some compelling presentations from the previous speakers. Nothing can be more alarming than products that threaten the very lives of consumers. We have seen over and over again counterfeit products that can kill or maim, such as exploding batteries, smoke detectors that don't detect smoke, toothpaste that contains diethylene glycol, which is an industrial chemical similar to antifreeze, counterfeit shampoo, counterfeit toys, baby food, brake pads that are made of compressed grass or sawdust, oil filters that contain crunched up newspapers or rags and no filter element, counterfeit medical devices, and the list goes on and on. The headline is, bad things happen to good people when they're exposed to counterfeit products. Take the case of Eric Kaplan and his wife Bonnie. On the day before Thanksgiving in 2005, the Kaplans thought they were getting Botox treatments, but instead they fell victim to a bootleg batch. They went from a healthy and active couple to sitting in a paralysis recovery unit in Atlanta. It took them weeks before they could barely speak or swallow. And then in 2007, in the most heart-wrenching case that one could imagine, 7-year-old Connor O'Keefe, while on vacation in Thailand with his parents, was found dead on the floor of his hotel room, clutching the wires of a counterfeit video game charger. These are real people, real stories, and real harm. In difficult economic times such as these, it's not surprising that consumers are looking for ways to save money where they can. And while counterfeiters are all too willing to offer up what appear to be bargains, the ultimate cost to the consumer may be measured in far more than dollars and cents. Criminals are profiting at the expense of our health and safety. I appreciate this opportunity to bring greater attention to this issue, and I look forward to the continuing discussion with the panel.
Thanks, Bob. Brett?
Good morning. As a foundation, we take counterfeiting electrical products very seriously. In fact, one of the things that the foundation has been great at is going out and talking to the media and the consumers to let them know what dangers are out there. This could be from extension cords, it could be from fake power strips, even to Christmas lights. And so as an organization, what we've really tried to do is simplify this to the consumer to make sure that they understand that these are dangerous goods and they can in fact infect you, your family, and your home. And we see a prevalence of that over the holidays. And so we've been featured on a number of morning shows, CBS last week. We've got a couple other things coming out across the nation where we've gone out and found these in local communities. And it's been a surprise even to me where we can find the same exact faulty devices or counterfeit devices in every community that we've been to. And we can actually take the media to the store and say, hey, look, we can purchase this in your own community. So it really does hit home to the consumers.
Thanks, Brett. Well, why don't we begin by talking a little bit more about what Bob just so eloquently and compellingly talked about, which is sort of the risks to consumers with respect to counterfeit products. Obviously, the audience heard a lot about pharmaceutical counterfeits this morning, but let's talk about some of the others and the dangers you all have seen. Keith, you want to start us off?
Yeah, well, I would be happy to. We see counterfeits appear in two kinds of ways. You know, I came to UL out of the medical device industry where people would counterfeit the device because it was so expensive and there was a lot of profit. We see some of that in the industry that we're in as well. For example, we will see people counterfeit fire sprinklers. Now, we haven't seen fire sprinklers counterfeit fire sprinklers in the U.S., but we've seen U.S. brand counterfeit fire sprinklers in large parts of Asia. And one of the things we worry about from a public safety perspective is what will happen when one of these high-rise buildings has a fire, as recently happened in Shanghai, for example. And we do test these counterfeits when we get them, and we find out that while they look like perfect copies, when they're exposed to the hazards, the hazardous environment of a fire, they tend to fail very quickly. And so we're quite concerned about that, not so much for the U.S. public, but for the public in the world. Second thing we see counterfeited under a brand name would be a product like a circuit breaker. And we've been involved in some seizures of circuit breakers. We've been involved in testing of circuit breakers. And again, we'll stress them the way we would normally stress a new product. And a new circuit breaker, when you overload it, will simply trip. A lot of the counterfeit circuit breakers that we've tested explode into a ball of flame, which could then start a nice little fire in your basement or in your apartment, and the consequence would be unfortunate. The other kind of counterfeiting we see is not really related to a brand, but simply an opportunity that somebody sees to make a product in a way that doesn't meet a safety standard, but can be cheaper. And one of the things today, of course, is that copper has gotten very expensive as a commodity. And so if you can make extension cords or Christmas tree lights or power strips that have less copper in the wiring than is necessary to meet the safety standard, when you're making hundreds of miles of wire, as a big manufacturer might, it can add up to a lot of money. And we have, for example, seen extension cords, you know, the nice big heavy orange ones that you would buy for your lawn or your garage that, you know, look like could carry any kind of current. Cut them open and find out there's only a telephone wire inside. And it turns out that the plastic is a lot cheaper than the copper. And if you have one of these things, will it set your garage on fire? Well, it depends on how heavily you overload it. We've certainly seen with counterfeit extension cords overloaded or loaded with a normal hairdryer, that they have actually gotten hot enough that they've caught fire. And, you know, having your hairdryer catch on fire in the morning is a bad way to start the day. Except, of course, no risk for me. And we've also seen other things, counterfeit nightlights. You know, they have the same kinds of problems. And, of course, this time of the year, we worry about counterfeit decorative lights because decorative lights, we use them all through the holiday season, and particularly when you put them on a Christmas tree that is a real tree that you also forget to water, then the combination of a counterfeit decorative light string that can produce enough heat to start a fire with a very dry tree, which is a great source of fuel, is a bad recipe for your home.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Keith. Neil, what about at Cisco? What are the kinds of products that you are seeing and the dangers that they can cause?
Sure. Well, I guess I'd say that if imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, then counterfeit is the most dangerous and among the most expensive. And the way that these risks manifest themselves with networking equipment, I think, is in a few different ways. The first is related to what Keith was just saying, where you have fire and safety risks from network outages. And certainly Cisco tests our genuine products using some of the protocols that our friends at UL tell us about and teach us. And so you have a higher risk, a higher incidence of network outage when you use counterfeit products. But I think there's some other risks that are perhaps more specific to networking. Another risk is the possibility of disclosure of confidential information. If you don't have proper security around your computer network, your internet, the prospect of information being disclosed that you don't want to be disclosed is real. And then we've also found a third instance when we test counterfeit products is that a number of the counterfeit products have hazardous substances in quantities that are not safe. So we find things like lead and cadmium and other harmful chemicals in much higher quantities than we do in genuine networking products. So the risks can be quite high, and I think that those risks are compounded when you think about the kind of information that passes through computer networks every day, whether it's related to medical information, health and safety information of patients, whether it's confidential financial information from our banks, or whether it's government information that's relied upon by various government agencies. And I think there are a couple of cases just from this year, from 2010, that are illustrative of that. Both of them took place and led to convictions this year. Both of them took place in Texas. The first, the Assure case, involved a Saudi citizen who was convicted of attempting to sell counterfeit Cisco equipment to the United States Marine Corps. Well, in the process of that case, a United States Marine Corps staff sergeant actually testified about the dire consequences that could have happened if the counterfeit equipment was in fact purchased and then implemented, because that networking equipment was destined for Iraq, specifically for Fallujah, and it was wonderful that there was an interdiction there, that did not happen. And that case is actually a wonderful case, an example where the Customs and Border Patrol came to Cisco and said, after we had worked with them over the years and talked about various indicia of counterfeit, and said, here's what we're seeing. Could you test these in your labs? Is this something that seems to meet the definition of counterfeit? And it ultimately had this happy outcome with a conviction at the end of the day. But it's a terrific example of when a case where the public sector brings a piece of information to us and we work with them. And that case ended up with a 51-month prison sentence. Similarly, in Texas, we had another case this year which led to a guilty plea and a 30-month prison sentence, where the counterfeit Cisco products were destined for the United States Air Force and the Federal Aviation Administration. So it's wonderful to work with law enforcement. It's particularly gratifying to have law enforcement come to us, as is often the case with these kinds of examples, and to get the convictions that we have. But you can see that in my space, in the world that Cisco lives in, the dangers are quite severe.
Thanks. Brett, we just heard Keith and Neil talk a bit about the risks. What are you seeing, and what are also the economic risks that you're identifying from these counterfeits?
Well, as an organization, we worked with the entire supply chain, from everybody from the power manufacturers, distributors, to the retailers, and even down to consumers and the installers. And what we did was develop a program called Counterfeits Can Kill. And what we wanted to do is make sure that people understood that all counterfeits aren't the same. Some are uniquely unforgiving, much like electricity if it's mishandled. So what we did is we really worked with everybody from the power companies and the large power distributors all the way down to who I call Bubba the electrician, to make sure that they understood that, look, it takes a group of effort to make sure that these things don't infiltrate the supply chain itself. And as I went out, and as an organization, as we went out and we started to find more and more of these things around the country, what we kind of found was it was kind of surprising where when you purchase purchase counterfeit devices from fake retailers or retailers that thought they were selling legitimate goods, they were not only putting themselves at risk, they were putting their businesses at risk and creating liabilities, and also creating, obviously the liabilities to their consumer, their partners. And so it was really something where everybody started to question, who do we go back to? Where does the liability ultimately end? And I think that that's something that at the end of the day, the consumer needs to better understand if they're looking for that product, they are a cog in that chain where the retailers can keep it out of the chain if in fact that's what the consumers want. But many times the consumers are saying, look, we want this inexpensive device, and they don't realize that there is an intrinsic danger to that device.
Are you finding, though, when you talk about that, Brad, are you finding that the retailer knows or doesn't know that he's selling a counterfeit product? Is it knowing? Is it unknowing? What are you finding?
Well, I think overall, you have about a 50-50 split. I think there's a lot of small businesses that operate on small margins, and they purchase things from flea markets and big discount chains that are out of this normal supply chain that a big retailer like a Walmart or Home Depot might purchase their goods from. Simply put is, they think they're selling legitimate products because it does have a certification mark. It looks like it's a legitimate product, and it has all the telltale signs that you might look for. But when you start looking closer and closer, you start to identify things like misspellings, no warranty, nobody standing behind the product, there's no address to reach back to say, hey, look, there's something wrong. I've even gone into a local five and dime store and actually purchased a device. The retailer told me not to purchase that particular brand, go purchase a different brand, and he held up a singed wire that somebody had returned to him. Now the problem is you're dealing with a person that's uneducated that's returning the product that can't afford anything else, but they're bringing back a product that they think that they did something wrong. And that's not the case with these devices. And so it's really kind of creating a problem where how big is the problem that is out there? It's a problem for us to identify what the issues are, but I can tell you that there are some things that you can do to as a consumer to combat those devices.
Bob, you obviously in your opening comments gave some very compelling examples. Do you want to just give a few more of the knockoffs
Sure.
or what you guys have been seeing?
Well, Lonnie, unfortunately, counterfeits have infiltrated every imaginable product sector, including many that none of us would want to imagine, from everyday consumer goods. And for instance, in the UK, the authorities seized counterfeit perfume that contained urine. Counterfeit children's toys contain high levels of lead and small parts that present choking hazards. Over in Rome, authorities seized counterfeit sneakers that contain high levels of cadmium. And just razors, counterfeit razors where the weld breaks and it causes people that are shaving to cut their skin. In Zambia, counterfeit shampoo that contained acid. And we've heard about batteries and the electrical components. So we know that these counterfeit goods, they'll maim and kill people, but they also kill jobs, and they also kill economies. And many of you might be familiar, in New York City, the comptroller did a report and said that the just lost sales tax revenue in New York City cost them $1 billion in revenue. In Los Angeles, the LA Economic Development Corporation did a study and said that the state of California lost $483 million in lost sales tax revenue. My friend Sheriff Lee Bach is sitting here from the LA Sheriff's Department. I'm sure he could use some of those funds to increase his department and protect public safety. So that's just some of the examples, Lonnie.
Right, thanks. It's compelling. Well, unless anyone wants that, I'm going to move us along. And as I said in my opening comments, we are incredibly committed at the Department of Justice and throughout the administration to effective law enforcement in combating counterfeiting, So I wanted to get all of your views on the ways that the Criminal Division and the U.S. Attorney's offices can partner up with you effectively so that we can bring record numbers of IP prosecutions. We already are. We want to continue that trend. And so I think each of you have had some experience there. Neil, do you want to talk to us a little bit about how Cisco teams up with law enforcement?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that our goal in working with law enforcement is really twofold. One is to work on prevention techniques, and then after the fact to work on referring law enforcement cases that are ripe and ready for prosecution. On the prevention side, we have a brand protection team all over the globe, and they spend a lot of time. Cisco, more than 90% of our products are sold through a distribution channel with distributors and resellers and systems integrators. So our brand protection team is works with our sales channel partners in that regard. But they also educate law enforcement agencies, Customs and Border Patrol, the immigration officers, FBI and the Justice Department, and work with them to try to explain, and provide manuals, photographs, different depictions to say, here are the specific indicia of counterfeit. When you see these kinds of things at ports of entry, you should come talk to us. We can work on that together, and we can see whether this is something that actually involves counterfeit. We've been doing this for about a decade, and maybe not so coincidentally, around that same time, the different chip units that Lanny was referring to, the computer hacking and IP crimes units at the U.S. Attorney's offices throughout the country were growing. I don't know that we've worked with all 230 of them. Sometimes it feels that way. But we have certainly worked with many of them and referred a lot of cases. And so today, really in the last 5 or 6 years, Cisco's been involved in referrals to law enforcement that have ended up with about almost 20 convictions, criminal convictions, in 8 different jurisdictions around the country, and with more than 26 years of prison sentences befalling the various defendants. So we feel like we've been an extraordinary beneficiary, as I said, of skill and resources that have been put into this problem throughout the country. And maybe the example that perhaps we're most proud of is 2 or 3 years ago, law enforcement came to Cisco and said, we're seeing all of these cases, but many of them have a common thread in the networking industry. And so the FBI, more than a dozen FBI offices, working with the Justice Department, working with Border Patrol, working with ICE, and also working with the Canadian Mounted Police in Canada, came to us to sort of put together a concerted group effort of looking at different search warrants, which ones make sense, are they coming from the same areas? And so ultimately, Operation Cisco Raider, which morphed into Operation Network Raider, because certainly this is an IT problem. It's not specific to Cisco any more than it is to any of our competitors. Ultimately, that ended up in an entire concerted effort, which led to more than $200 million of product seizures, dozens of search warrants being issued, and more than 10 convictions alone just in that particular area. So again, these are examples. Some of these are cases that we've referred to law enforcement. But the good story around this is that different law enforcement agencies working collaboratively actually then came back to us and said, let us tell you some of the common things that we're seeing case after case, and let's work on these things together to get a better result. And Operation Cisco Raider and Network Raider is really a rather terrific one, and that ultimately came to pass in 2008.
Well, thank you. Keith, what are you finding at UL, and tell us a little bit about the partnerships and what you're finding that's effective.
We've done a couple of things, and the UL anti-counterfeiting activity is really based on a platform of three ideas. The first is partnerships, the second is education, and the third is enforcement. And we're a bit unique because we're not a manufacturer, we're simply a test agent. And so our mark, if it's counterfeited, is usually counterfeited along with the brand of some other right holder. For example, Cisco or somebody else. So I mentioned earlier that 3 years ago we started to organize this IP crime conference. There have been 4 of them now, and basically to bring law enforcement together from around the world to talk about issues related to specifically law enforcement on IP crime. And the idea that we've had from UL is simply that being an independent group as we are, we could be a facilitator to allow that conversation to happen. You know, we're not a law enforcement agency. We have very little expertise in that regard, but we think we're pretty good as a facilitator. The second thing we've done over the last 2 years in partnership with Interpol, we've developed an intellectual property rights crime college that Interpol is now offering and will be available for training customs officials around the world through Interpol on specifically how to recognize and deal with counterfeit kinds of products. And then on the enforcement side, what we do is we do our own work on the ground. So we have a team in China, a team in Hong Kong. And again, we're not looking specifically just for counterfeit UL marks, because that mark is always associated with somebody else's product. And then in China specifically, for the last 5 years, we've had an ongoing dialogue with what we would call our partner organization, AQSIQ, about the issues of anti-counterfeiting, and specifically from the perspective that it isn't U.S. versus China, it's U.S. and China against criminals. And there's a couple interesting things have happened in the last few weeks. Beginning in November, I was with the U.S.-China Business Council Board, the Secretary-Treasurer, and we make an annual trip to China. We had an hour with the Commerce Minister, Chen Deming, and he told us, by the way, in a couple of days, the Premier is going to announce this anti-counterfeiting initiative, which I've been given the responsibility for. And, you know, we've heard these before, so is it really serious? But something interesting he said was that, you know, intellectual property from a Chinese perspective is a Western idea that's never really existed in the Chinese culture. He said, but now we've come to realize that in the 21st century, in a digital economy, that unless we have our own intellectual property, our economy is going to be significantly handicapped. And unless we can protect the value of IP for our young people in China who can develop it, they're either not going to do it or they're going to leave China and develop it somewhere else. And so, therefore, he said, we finally come to realize that we have to do this for our own self-interest. And then I think it was 2 or 3 days later, Wen Jiabao announced this 6-month program, which we think can possibly go a lot further. And one of the last comment, one of the interesting points that Chen Deming made about this was that as a sign of kind of showing good faith, the government has decided to try to eradicate all pirated software on all government-owned computers. And he said, by the way, we need help because that's a huge amount of money, and somebody can help us with the reduced price. But maybe it's a good way to set a principle. But our other partner organization, CNCA, which is the China National Certification Agency, visited us just last week in Chicago. And they said, oh, by the way, you know, we have this thing going on with anti-counterfeiting. Could you help us understand how to put together an anti-counterfeiting program in China? Because the Chinese CCC mark, which is like the UL mark of China, is also being counterfeited. Mm-hmm. So that kind of partnership negotiation, it's been going on for 5 years. I think it's starting to work.
So one of the keys, I guess, is that to be an effective law enforcement partner in at least certain parts of the world, it's not going to happen overnight. You just have to be with it, and it's a form of both enforcement and education, I guess.
It's a long-term partnership, and I think for us the major point of discussion was always to keep reinforcing it isn't China bashing.
Right.
You're just as much a victim of this as we are, and we've been able to show them these counterfeit fire sprinklers and show them what happens to them in a fire and say, these are not in buildings in New York, but they probably are in buildings in Shanghai and Beijing.
Right. Bob, you were talking about Los Angeles and law enforcement there, but tell us a little bit about your thinking on partnerships with law enforcement, what you have found effective.
Sure. And I'd be remiss, since Andrea Sharon's here from CSIPS, if I don't advocate again for federal, state, local IP task forces on the law enforcement side, which has been my mantra for a couple years now, right, Andrea? But Lonnie, I think, you know, this setting, it speaks volumes, and what it really is a task force. It's coordination and collaboration. And I look around the room, and I see folks that we've collaborated with, you know, on the ground, at least our member companies on a daily basis. Andrea Sharon, Mike DeBose from CSIPS, DOJ, you guys do a terrific job. Sheriff Lee Barker, who I've been out there on many occasions and saw the working relationships that the Sheriff's Department has, not only, you know, with the LAPD. I was out there when they coordinated an effort with the Beaverton, Oregon Police Department. And ICE has been terrific partners, working with New York City Police Department, Rich Halverson from the IPR Center, And it's just growing leaps and bounds, and it just makes sense about sharing costs, coordinating efforts, sharing intelligence. Meredith Aldridge is here from Mississippi Attorney General's office, Attorney General Jim Hood, who just recently put together an IP task force for the state of Mississippi. I just got outreach from the Louisiana Attorney General, who's also interested in those type of partnerships. The North Carolina Secretary of State's office has been very visible and engaged in this type of work. So in this type of economy, you can't do this alone. As I said at a lot of these forums, state and local police have a treasure trove of information. They go out and do this work on a daily basis. And this type of strategic partnership that they've formed with ICE and the FBI and other folks just makes sense. And I think it's going to be the wave of the future, with economies trimming and budgets being slashed, that folks have to work together. And just one last point on this, Lonnie, and the brand holders play an important role in that. And specifically, and I know we'll touch on this in the next segment, working with law enforcement and government agencies, not only on the enforcement side, but on the education side.
Right. Hey, Bob, I know that education really matters, and I also know that outreach matters, and you were talking about Mississippi and Louisiana and all those places you go. I just want to know, when you're in Mississippi and you're in a restaurant, do they understand you?
Believe it or not, there's a chief of police that Jim Houston in Ridgewood, or I think it's Ridgewood, and Jim and I went for our master's program at the University of Alabama. So whenever I go to Mississippi, he orders the food for me.
Bob proves charm surmounts everything. Hey, Brett, do you want to add anything to law enforcement and strategies and partnerships?
Not necessarily for what we do, but I
Right.
think in terms of, I think communication is the biggest thing, and I think information sharing is the biggest thing. As an electrical industry, I think it's important that, you have competitors that sit at the same table, even on my board of directors, and they have no problem talking about what they've done correctly in combating counterfeiting. But it's also interesting that the one that seems to be the strongest at it tends to have the least amount of product out there. And it's like the counterfeiters know that if if let's say a particular brand is going out there and fighting them, they're going to switch to a different brand. And so the effort and the information share between everybody up and down the supply chain with law enforcement, and the communication with the consumers to say, look, you need to look out for this stuff is out there. I think it's key. I think with protecting brands, I think that's one thing that's really set the foundation itself up well, is we can go out and talk about the issue. Leave brands out of it, but talk about the overall dangers to the consumer, and that's something that's going to get some resonance with the consumers that are out there. And I think they can understand that, look, we're not bad-mouthing a particular brand, but there is issues out there that you need to be aware of.
Neil?
Yeah, and we've also talked throughout the morning about resource constraints on these things, and both for law enforcement and private industry. And I would just say, from Cisco's perspective, and looking at the work that we've done on this and some of the criminal referrals we've made, these cases often end with restitution dollars, but the dollars coming back to the victim here, I mean, they can be substantial, but by and large they're not, and oftentimes the defendant may be judgment-proof. I don't think that the trademark holders are doing this because they think it's a great return on investment on dollars. They're doing it because it's a corporate citizenship issue, right? And some of our government leaders today have talked about that there's a moral responsibility for doing this. So I don't think that the dollars that are put in by private industry is designed to say, we're going to get X cents on the dollar back, and here's how it's accrual to the bottom line. It's really just saying this is something that we all have to be doing, and if we do it as efficiently as possible, that's the best way.
Terrific. Agreed. Well, we've sort of alluded to it throughout the first couple of topics, but let's move to education for a moment. We're really in a unique setting. The administration has set up this remarkable conference. Victoria Espinel has been hosting it. The AG has been here. So we really have a rare opportunity to reach a much wider audience, retailers, consumers. How do we educate people? How do we talk about what's safe and unsafe? How do we talk about what we should do next? Brett, you started there, but why don't you start us off and talk a little bit about educating businesses and consumers and how to avoid counterfeiting?
Sure, I think, you know, at the end of the day, everybody's worried about liability. And that comes back from, you know, anybody that is an installer that's a one-person business, two guys in the back of the truck that purchase everything they have from a local retailer like Home Depot. There's a real, you know, key message there that if you can touch people when they purchase the products and let them know that they're getting genuine products, there is, you know, a side of sales to that. And I think it's a lot of times it comes down to people need to understand there is value in purchasing legitimate products from legitimate retailers and distributors. And if you can get that message across and have them understand that, look, it's not worth the risk of purchasing online to save a couple cents, it makes sense. And I think, you know, we need to give the customer the benefit of the doubt and have them, you know, understand the difference between a genuine product and a counterfeit.
Keith, what are you finding? What works, what resonates? How do you get the message out so people care and understand it?
Well, I think that, you know, this is really an uphill battle, and it's going to be hard. With Brian's permission, I'll use one of his own experiences, which I think illustrates the point well. Brian was involved with the RCMP. They were doing a seizure of goods at a store, and a lady came in, a customer, and she said, the officer said, well, you know, ma'am, the store is closed. We're seizing the goods. They're counterfeit goods. And she said, but, you know, I ordered some decorative lights that I need for a party I'm having tonight. They said, well, but ma'am, you know, these are counterfeit goods. They're dangerous. They could burn down your house. She said, well, okay, but do you think they would burn down my house tonight? And, you know, I think we have a real issue of consumer perceptions, and partly people say it's a victimless crime.
Right.
Sometimes people say, well, you know, yeah, I was downloading movies or software, but, you know, those people are all millionaires, and, you know, it's really no penalty to them. Sometimes they don't think about, you know, the consequences to themselves of having a dangerous product. We've heard many stories today about medicines and toothpaste and so on and so forth. Sometimes it's just cool. You know, I lived 11 years in Asia, and I can't believe how many people thought it was cool to have a fake Rolex. I thought it was cool to have a real Rolex, but I never thought a fake one was cool, but it was. I mean, people wanted to buy these things, and as, you know, Chairman Tenenbaum said, you walk through lots of markets in Asia, and they're everywhere. If you go onto a college campus today or into a high school, it's very easy to round up 100 people probably in 5 minutes to go out and protest against, you know, protect baby seals. I walk down Michigan Avenue in front of Neiman Marcus this time of year. There's always people outside protesting buying fur, but nobody thinks about the consequences of buying counterfeit products or buying illegal narcotics, which are, in many cases, far more profound than protecting baby seals, which we should do. But that's, you know, that's a consequence that people don't draw. And how you're going to get people, consumers, to start to think about this from a different perspective is, I think, a heck of a challenge.
Yeah. Well, obviously, you were describing some success there, Keith, with respect to dealing with your counterparts in China, and you were talking about Interpol. So is the message you just have to have a sort of a long view and be patient and just keep at it?
Well, we do, but I think somehow we need to figure out a way to get to actual consumers. And I really do kind of see counterfeit products and maybe illegal narcotics having a similarity in that if unless you can stem the demand, you'll never stem the supply, because there's always somebody who will figure out how to make it if somebody will buy it. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's terrific to do all the things on law enforcement, and it's really important, and we should do more and have more resource. But hopefully we can also find a way to start to connect with consumers to say, you know, fundamentally, when you're buying this, you're doing something wrong for a lot of reasons that you really should care about, besides the fact that, you know, Cisco's not going to get the sale.
Right. So, Neil, does that work? Cisco's not going to get the sale? I mean, what do you all do, and what's your view about education and getting the message out, and how do you try to get your arms around this problem?
Yeah, I mean, you don't start with Cisco or the company's not going to get the sale. As people on the previous panel mentioned, we need to educate with the fact that there's huge profits that go into this counterfeit schemes, and that those dollars go to fund other harmful illicit activity. And so the ramifications of this are myriad. And so I think that's important. John Clark mentioned the IBM ad that was talking about how a certain percentage of medicine, global medicine, is counterfeit, and here's one way to attack that. I think that years ago, a lot of brand owners, their initial reaction when they learned that they, in fact, had a problem with counterfeit was to say, well, let's not talk much about this, because either our shareholders or other people in our ecosystem, may get scared about it. I think today, fortunately, there's a realization that a certain percentage of global trade is counterfeit. The question is, what are we doing about it? And so I think on the education and the awareness, we're moving in the right direction. Specific to our industry, as I said before, we sell primarily through a distribution network. So, Bob said earlier that in difficult economic times, it's understandable that people are going to put cost as a primary decision maker here. But at the same time, you want to try to talk to your procurement officers, people who are making buying decisions, and say that cost is certainly an important criteria, but that there are others, and that you want to know where you're buying this stuff from. You want to incorporate some sort of certification process of authenticity, so that you know whatever it is, whatever the product is that you're buying, you know where it came from. You're asking your suppliers where it is that they are getting that product from. And by and large, most manufacturers have an authorized channel where they have relationships with these partners, they have audit rights with these partners, and they have the ability to sort of impose a trust but verify model. So I don't think any brand owner can say, well, if you buy through my channel, you have nothing to worry about, but certainly you can lower those risks dramatically, in part because if there is a counterfeit that goes through an authorized channel, there are consequences to that legitimate business. They're no longer going to be able to sell these particular products. They're going to have real negative consequences for their business. So there are ways to mitigate risk here, but I think a big part of it is talking to procurement officers and saying, and empowering them to say authenticity and verification has to be part of that process.
Terrific. Bob, what's your view on this? How the word gets out? What have you done? What are you aware of? What's effective? What would you like to see happen?
Lonnie, I just want to segue back to the last discussion for a minute, just to say that collaboration and education and public messaging, they're not mutually exclusive. And I just want to give you some examples of working with government agencies, which we did at the ICC, and we did some consumer messaging in New York, in Paris, in Los Angeles, in Mexico City. And we did that, and again, I have a vested interest in this being cost-effective, because most of the folks on this panel and a lot of people in the audience are members of the ICC, and these campaigns can be very expensive, so I want to make sure you have enough money left over to pay the dues for the ICC. But having said that, the first collaboration we had was actually with Mayor Bloomberg, and in New York City. We put together some digital ads. They ran for 3 months in Times Square. We did them at the Reuters NASDAQ billboard, the CBS Superscreen, the Kodak Jumbotron. And just to bring in some private partners, since Kodak is a member of ICC, they gave us the space for free on top of the Marriott Marquis. That's where the Kodak Jumbotron is. Calvin Klein's a member of ICC. They worked with an ad agency. They created the digital ad. We went out to Los Angeles. We partnered up with Sheriff Lee Barker again and Clear Channel. And we produced these billboards, and they ran on the 405 freeway. We partnered up with Union des Fabricants over in France, and we translated the ads into French. And they've been in Orly Airport and Nice Airport, all around France. We partnered up with some law firms in Mexico, and they put these they put up billboards in Mexico City. Now let me get back to the cost. That cost us $5,000. So many of you know what these ads can cost. Also, Mayor Bloomberg offered up Verizon kiosks where we put those ads up there. The difficult part, because the time's limited, when you do these digital ads, because we did some follow-up to see how effective they are. And people that were walking down Times Square said it was probably a 20-second ad. They said if we saw it, it had an impact. So the difficult part is, trying to get it in the right spot. And I think the message that we had worked well. Depending on the city. In New York City, Mayor Bloomberg wanted ads that said, you cost your city $1 billion. Sheriff Lee Baca, they wanted ads that talked about the connection to gang activity. But I think the messaging when you're able to catch the consumer's attention, you know, it does resonate.
So Bob, one takeaway really could be that people in the audience representing private industry could be dealing with their local municipalities and their cities and their mayors and trying to figure out ways in a collaborative effort to get the message out, and whether the message is like in Los Angeles, this helps gangs or organized crime, or it's robbing the city of tax dollars. Maybe that is one thing that is a more national way we could, in a partnership, do.
Yeah, I agree, Lanny. And also, you know, just on something Keith said, enforcement's very important, and I think consumer education is essential and critical. And again, I spent a career in law enforcement. I worked in narcotic units. If you don't do something on the demand side, it's a very difficult challenge. So I think the public education is very important. I think these forums are important, and I just want to take advantage of the forum for 1 minute. You know, we don't like to reinvent the wheel, and I heard some very interesting topics in the first panel. Pharmaceutical people are always ahead of the curve, and I know there's some folks from Google and from Amex and Visa, and we represent over 200, you know, companies from apparel, luxury goods, automotive, food, entertainment, software. I'd like to see how we could partner up with Google, with Amex, with Visa, and get a shot at, you know, trying to make the same model work that's working for the pharmaceutical folks. Because I got to tell you, you know, besides the health and safety issues, these companies are getting killed. And I started out when I retired from law enforcement working for the music industry, where a song would be on the top 20 for probably 30 weeks. If you look now, it may be you're lucky if a top hit lasts for 2 weeks, because after that it's just completely counterfeited. Where companies were worth $20 billion are now worth $11 billion. So it's health and safety, and it's also the health of the economy. So I'd love some opportunities to partner up with some of the ISPs and the pay servers and stuff like that. So thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. So another takeaway is not just more partnerships with municipalities and governments, but with companies as well, company-to-company partnerships. Well, we've been going for a while. I think we wanted to leave time for our audience, so we're hopeful that the audience has questions for this terrific panel. Yes, sir?
I'm Jim Berger with Dow Lotus. I work with the SIA and the Counterfeiting Task Force. I want to praise your U.S. Attorney here in D.C. and his D.C. Counterfeit Microelectronics Task Force. They've done 2 raids. Speaking of some of the examples are really frightening. They found counterfeit chips that were going into the controller boards for Raytheon missiles being sold to the military. Found a chip that was going into a controller for high-speed trains. We found chips that go into defibrillators that fail. So I really think they're doing a terrific job, and I'd like to see more of your U.S. attorneys working on these projects.
That's terrific. I appreciate you saying that. We have a terrific partnership with our U.S. attorney here. In fact, he was just here and just left a little while ago. But as I said before, with Victoria Espinel and with the Attorney General, we really are very committed. And in the same theme of partnerships, the U.S. Attorney's offices and the Criminal Division are really working very closely together on these issues. So thanks for pointing that out. Yes, ma'am.
I also actually just have a comment. Thank you so much for putting the panel together. I'm Mary Snap from Microsoft, and we're talking some about hardware and networking. But with software, it's actually a significant issue, too, in terms of safety for consumers. We have many investigations which have revealed that counterfeit software has also been infected with malware. The simple thing is, and it's a bad thing, that it causes data crashes for the individual consumer. But we also have instances where the computer is taken over by a botnet, if you will, and is then used by cyber criminals to undertake illegal activity. So we also see lots of instances where something as simple as counterfeit software causes, because of the ability for networking and the internet, damage that goes far beyond that individual PC. We've had cases where credit card information is taken, where individual files and data is lost. So extreme privacy violations too. So it's also an area for us to continue to work on, and we appreciate our work with law enforcement on counterfeit for many years, and particularly then as we go into this area, again, of malware and safety issues for consumers and small businesses.
Well, thanks for raising that issue. I mean, our CSIP section and the U.S. attorneys working with CSIPs are dealing really on a daily basis with the kind of issues that you're raising here, and we have many investigations, but there's no question that counterfeiting makes all of these issues much more grave and prevalent. Other questions or praise for us? We'll take as much praise as you want. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Michelle Boykins. I'm with the National Crime Prevention Council, and we're actually about to embark on doing a public education campaign. And what I wanted to ask of people in the audience is, have they, when they've done any public education outreach, have they found a message that was particularly really one of those messages that people gravitated to out in the public? Because we've been hearing from our research that the public saying, don't scare us, tell us how we can help, what we can do, but they also really have that lure of the bargain that is so huge to overcome. So I'm interested to hear from you guys on the panel and from anyone else in the audience if you found an effective message that works.
That really is a great question. Are there effective messages that either our panelists or people in the audience have heard that has resonated with different aspects of our community?
You know, I don't think that I have an effective message for you. I wish I actually did, because we desperately need it as a society. The one thing that we've been doing at UL in the last few years is trying at this time of the year to communicate basic holiday safety messages to people about, you know, water your Christmas tree if you have a live tree, you know, check your lights to make sure the wires aren't frayed, you know, the usual holiday safety messages. And the two things that we have found to be very effective, one is to really target your audience, because, you know, to reach 307 million people in America with one message is incredibly expensive, and unless you're super rich, and we're not, that doesn't work. So we've been targeting at young moms because they tend to be the ones in the home who would be most focused on the Christmas tree, if there is one, or the decorative lights. And I think the second thing that we found incredibly effective with that particular demographic is also then focus on proper utilization of social media. Because if there's anybody in America who's more connected than young moms, it's probably you don't know them. Those are the two things we found that would work, but for your message, maybe it's a different thing.
And Lonnie, what I was going to say, you know, on top of what Keith said is, you know, you have to tailor the message to your audience. And, you know, specifically, if you talk about gangs in New York, it may not resonate like it does in Los Angeles. When you talk about terrorism and $1 billion in tax revenue in New York City, and you're somebody walking by the air and you just got laid off, the message starts to resonate. So I think it's very important. And I do think that there is messaging that does resonate, and some of it's on the economic side. On the terrorist side, I've heard it, you know, both ways, but if you have a strong example and real life situation, that does resonate. So again, I think it's important to focus on who the audience is.
Sir?
I'm from California, San Diego, and I'm also a physician. So wherever John is, I'll tell him there's one physician who does care about this issue. But just from, I work primarily in counterfeit drugs, the counterfeit drugs area, and work a lot with minority populations. And one of our critical conceptions that we have found is, number one, I mean, no, I'm not dissing anybody who's tried to do an educational activity to try to inform consumers about counterfeits. You got to know your populace. The guys have been saying that. I can tell you, we did a survey study in Southern California Vietnamese, and what we found was not a single one of them, there's over 500 different survey administrations, not a single one of them had ever heard an FDA warning. But every single one of them had been solicited for counterfeit drugs on the internet, on email, and on the radio. And the other thing that's really important in the Vietnamese community that the counterfeiters got was that Vietnamese people don't go on the internet to hang out and look for stuff or get information. The moms and the buyers listen to the radio. So that's how our public health messages got the biggest impact, that we actually got and understood the epidemiology of the listener. The second thing we found with our group, with some of the other groups that we got a good feedback from, We went to community centers and the senior groups because they consume a lot of the drugs. With the senior groups, we showed them, we're going to introduce you to the internet, and we're going to show you how you're going to get ripped off. And we went through and gave them a slide of this is how you sign in, and look, no prescription necessary. So you got to there, and then we showed how we can break off all the credit card information, all the personal information, the social security number, and we showed them how that worked in a variety of different languages. And then we went on and showed this impacts you in the future, and then we showed pictures that folks in the first session showed about how horrible the conditions were. And Marcia Bergeron, the case that the lady died specifically. When we got impact, we went back 6 months later to some of these sites, a random sample of these sites, they remembered. They actually did remember. So we have some outcomes data. If you show graphically to the senior population in their language, you actually can get a good benefit out of it. And particularly, what we found was the number one thing that we actually get most response from, if you got a former law enforcement guy there, and you can say, let me tell you, this ain't fake. This ain't a put-up job. This isn't about protecting the industry. This is about me and you, and I'm trying to help you. And that really helps. You know, they don't want to listen to a doctor. They don't listen to me anyway. But they listen to the law enforcement guy. So that's what I would encourage. If you are going to try to do this, again, tailor your message, use graphics, number one. And number two, find out what people are listening to. Find out where they get that information and hit them hard with it. Because you're right, we're now working on social media for the college students because they're all ordering stuff over the internet left and right. So. Thank you.
Ma'am?
You might need a translator for me. My name's Meredith Aldridge. I'm from the Mississippi Attorney General's office. And one thing that we've really tried to do is just really repeat the message, doing things like Keith mentioned, tailoring our regular press releases that we normally do for consumer product safety issues, you know, holiday shopping, whatever the case may be. We try to add to that, oh, and by the way, make sure that you're buying real, and here are some ways that you might be able to tell whether the products that you're buying or the location that you're buying from is a legitimate location. And we also sought grant funding through BJA. We're very thankful to have, where we were able to create a series of public service announcements where we did try to tailor a very specific message, like a lot of folks have mentioned here. We did one with a gentleman whose wife had been rushed to the hospital who had bought drugs over the internet. It's a real message that we got a lot of positive feedback from. We did one with the recording industry that really was targeted more at college students with a popular recording artist in our area. We've had a lot of support for the types of messages that we've been doing. Another thing that we've done is decided to go right to the source where a lot of these products are being sold. We have a lot of flea markets in Mississippi, a lot of you know, just very informal marketplaces. And what we've done is divided our state into 12 regions and just used our local law enforcement partners there that we have through a task force to really just get the message out there. We created a pamphlet, a brochure. It's very simple, and we pass that information out at these flea markets. And one of the remarkable things that we found there is that these not only will the buyers be very interested in the information that we do pass out, but also we've noticed that a lot of vendors are quietly packing up in the corners. So we know that the message is really spreading there, and that's one thing that we've really tried to do is just spread it across the state by repeating and repeating and repeating this message any way that we can.
That's great.
Lanny, if I may.
Sure, of course, Brett.
I always tie back into my grandfather for some reason, but he always told me, you don't know what you don't know. I think the message is consistent across the board is if you can tell people what to look out for, I think that they're smart enough to know what to look out for. I really kind of feel like, in the electrical industry, when you start looking at statistics in the market that you want to go after, who to address, it's funny, when I first got here, I think everybody in the room would look to save where they can on cell phone chargers and their iPod chargers and stuff like that, and the rat's nest that exists underneath their computer. But when it comes down to your expensive electronics that you deal with on a daily basis, you're putting those at risk. It's not just you. I mean, that's bad enough. But when you start talking about your high-end electronics, your TVs and your iPods and all that kind of good stuff, you really start to resonate that message with people that you might not think would care. And I could say, looking at myself, like pointing the finger, looking at the thumb, that I've done, the same thing before I got here. So before I knew it, I had, counterfeit stuff that I, bought off of eBay just like everybody else could have. And so it's important to realize that it's not affecting somebody else, it's actually affecting everybody in this room and the people you might know. So it's something that I think information is the key.
Any other questions or comments? Well, then, please join me in thanking our remarkable panel. It was really great. Neil, Keith, Bob, and Brett, thank you. And thank you all for being here.
Thanks very much. Great meeting you.
Lonnie, thank you. It's always a pleasure.
Before I introduce our last speaker, let me just say, if you have business in the White House after this meeting, you are not cleared to come back in the building, so you have to stay in the building. You can't leave. There's a crappy cafeteria on this floor. If you don't have business in the White House after this meeting, the Secret Service requests that large groups not sort of mill around the OEOB. So please leave. Thanks, Lynn. Appreciate it. Leroy Baca serves as the sheriff of Los Angeles County. Sheriff Lee Baca is a 45-year veteran of law enforcement who recently was reelected to his fourth term as sheriff. He commands the largest sheriff department in the United States with nearly 10,000 sworn personnel and 8,000 professional staff, serving nearly 10 million residents in Los Angeles County. Sheriff Baca and his team really get the importance of IP enforcement at the local level, and we're proud to call him a partner in this fight. Please welcome Sheriff Baca.
Thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be here with all of you. I want to particularly thank the Office of Intellectual Property Enforcement, particularly Victoria Espinel, and of course Andrew Klein, who as the senior advisor has been very instrumental in pulling all this together. I'll try and get as brief as I can be, because I know you really are wanting to move on, and this has been an outstanding conference for all of us. Until recently, the investigation of intellectual property crimes and the sale of counterfeit products has been viewed by many local law enforcement agencies as an untraditional criminal activity and not been seen as a significant threat to public safety. However, all that's changed. And it's my firm belief that the theft of intellectual property and the sale of counterfeit products pose a major threat to the vitality and security of our country. Due in large part to a second one-year grant from the Bureau of Justice Assistance, my department has made more than 120 arrests and seized more than $50 million in counterfeit and pirated goods. Many of these arrests, from importer to warehousemen to local retailers, have reduced the flows of dangerous products to our citizens. Some of these criminals have included members of notorious street gangs who use profits gained from counterfeit goods to further their street-level enterprises, which threaten the safety of our communities. One such investigation involved a Los Angeles County gang by the name of Florencia 13. A gang member was selling pirated Xbox, PlayStation, and Y games through an internet site. He would arrange the delivery of these games, which he was selling for $5 each, less than 1/10 the legitimate retail value. A number of undercover buys were made, and a search warrant was served in collaboration with our partners from Immigration and Customs Enforcement. During the service of the search warrant, more than 500 hard copies were recovered, as well as the electronic systems used to illegally mass produce the counterfeit copies. Forensic examination of the computer software was able to uncover 4,500 games from the hard drives belonging to the suspect. The retail value of the games was approximately $92,000. A criminal filing was sought from the local district attorney. despite the suspect having 5 previous arrests for grand theft auto, narcotics violations, and burglary, no felony convictions had occurred, and the district attorney would only agree to a misdemeanor charge. Undeterred, our investigators contacted the United States attorney who had accepted the case for federal prosecution. And so that clearly establishes that another option is one that ought to be used in this kind of crime if we cannot get a serious and hardcore felony prosecution locally. Another method that street gangs use to garner significant profits from the illicit sales of counterfeit goods is by taxing the businesses that are selling the illegal merchandise. One incident involved perhaps the most dangerous and prolific transnational gang, the Mata Salvatrucha, or MS-13. MS-13 began in the mid-1980s and was originally comprised of El Salvadorian nationals fleeing to Los Angeles from their country's civil war. The gang quickly gained prominence in the Los Angeles area as they adapted from their violent national conflict to an urban menace using the unadulterated violence and cruelty that gangs use. This gang has established a presence in Central America, Mexico, Canada, and in cities across the nation, including Washington, D.C. In this instance, the seller was operating a warehouse that was manufacturing counterfeit clothing under the brand names of Hollister, Ed Hardy, True Religion, and Abercrombie & Fitch. MS-13 was taxing the counterfeiter to allow him to remain in business. The counterfeiter was protected by MS-13 from theft and robbery of other street criminals who feared through the wrath of the MS-13, if anyone interfered with a counterfeiting operation. The counterfeit operator was in business for several years prior to his arrest and generated tens of thousands of dollars worth of illegal product and paid thousands of dollars in tax to the gang. The suspect was arrested after a 6-month investigation, culminating in the multi-agency nationwide Operation Fire Sale takedown in August of this year. And we do work closely with the FBI along with Customs and Enforcement because Los Angeles County is the port of entry for 40% of all the imported goods to the United States and Canada. So clearly we have a clear, predictable path to interrupt. During the post-arrest interview, and while knowingly facing several federal charges, the suspect refused to divulge the identity of the gang members who extorted him for the fear of death or injury to him and his family. The fact that he feared the gang more than federal prison illustrates the malevolence and reach of this despicable transnational gang. My final example is an investigation involving another notorious Los Angeles street gang called the Insane Crips. This Insane Crip gang member, who had an arrest record for crimes including attempted murder, robbery, kidnapping, assault with a deadly weapon, burglary, and narcotics violations, was selling various types of counterfeit clothing and shoes using the brand names of Nike, Ed Hardy, Polo, True Religion, and Lacoste. He advertised on the internet, and after investigators made multiple undercover buys, was arrested and a search warrant was served at his residence. More than $150,000 worth of clothing was seized. It was determined that he was using his profits to increase his status in the gang by direct tribute and the financing of wholesale narcotics activities. It is clear that violent street gangs have evolved into sophisticated criminal enterprises, using the sale and, more correctly, the profits from this low-risk, high-reward undertaking to enhance their street terrorism in cities across the nation. The low risk of apprehension, the lack of training and resources by law enforcement, the belief by many that this is a victimless crime or low-priority crime, the unknowing or unwitting consumers looking for a bargain, all contribute to the greedy desire by a criminal street gang to enter into the world of counterfeit and piracy. These three cases are only a representation of the numerous counterfeit cases investigated by my department that have direct links to street gangs. As long as counterfeiting and product piracy generate the money desired by gang members, this activity will continue. Much more needs to be done. I'm here to tell you that local law enforcement is willing to accept the challenge. I'm grateful for the leadership of the Department of Justice, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and all our federal enforcement colleagues, especially our trusted private sector brand owners, particularly the International Anti-Counterfeiting Coalition partners who have assisted the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department in developing a robust investigative program. I'm committed to expanding our partnerships and to expanding the investigative resources of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department to impact the threat of intellectual property theft. And finally, as 4 summary points of those panelists that preceded me who are extraordinarily informed and outstanding, and that's why I'm glad I'm here, because I learned a lot from them, is that Tom Kubik's comment about incident-based reporting is a very important part of the solution. Law enforcement has to call out from the Part 1 felonies that we report to the FBI what specifically are the domains of certain high-priority needs that our national economic safety strategy would entail. And one would be to have these type crimes further cataloged within our crime analysis sectors where we do the overall summation of what our effort is in enforcing the law specifically. Secondly, require perhaps through legislations, through states, and I'll work on this with the California legislature, to require all licensed pharmacies to warn the public about counterfeit drugs. All consumers do go to licensed pharmacies first, and then eventually, for whatever their reasons are, select into the counterfeit market forces. Third, encourage foreign nations to establish an underwriters laboratories program, as we've heard today, as well as the International Anti-Counterfeiting Coalition program. And then lastly, require, as was talked about in the audience by one member, of what is done in Mississippi, and that is for all local law enforcement agencies to have a strategy that they can continually develop across jurisdictional lines. Thank you very much for having me here. Thank you, Andrew, for your work. Thank you very much for the time that you've given me.
So I want to thank everyone very, very much for being here today on this very, very cold day. We really appreciate it. I also want to say thank you to my team. There aren't too many of them, but they are fantastic. So Tom Stoll, Eric Silber, and James Schulke are great. And also thank you to Andrew Klein for this event, for the private sector initiative that we've been working on, and for all the other many things that you are doing in the office. This is really fantastic. As I hope has been made clear today, we are, as an administration, we are tackling this problem on a number of fronts. One of the things that we need to have is aggressive law enforcement, and that's clearly happening. But we also need to be engaging with the private sector and working on voluntary and cooperative efforts, and that's clearly happening as well. One of the things that we also need to be doing is working on an international scale and with our international partners. And in that vein, I want to say that we are lucky to have here today the Ambassador for Safe Medicines from the Government of France and the Director for Counterfeit Medicines of Interpol. And we look forward to working with you and others to take our efforts overseas. We have a big problem on our hands, as I think is clear, and we have a lot that needs to be done. But I am truly confident that if we all work together, we will make real progress. I think we will take criminal actors down, and we will stop these types of activities that are not only a harm to our economy, but have a truly horrible negative impact on the health and safety of our consumers. So thank you very, very much, and we look forward to working with all of you.